What's up, everybody? Today I am doing my May reading wrap up. I read a total of 14 books this month, so I had a pretty decent reading month. I'm pretty happy with what I read, and yeah, I'll be going in the order that I read these in, which is usually how I do this. And yeah, I'll try not to do like too long of reviews for each of these books. Generally, with when I read a lot of books in a month, I don't want these videos to end up being like an hour long, so I'll just kind of do brief reviews for most of these. But let's just get started. The very first book that I read this month is Let the Right One In by John Lindquist. If I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, I don't know. I'm sure many of you have probably heard of this book. This is basically a very famous vampire novel that was written back in the early 2000s, I believe. I can double check the date on this. 2004. Yeah, 2004, and then it looks like the English translation was published in 2007. And this was originally what was this, a Swedish novel or something? I don't remember. Or German, or I don't know. But yeah, this is a very famous vampire novel. It's got blurbs on the front here. It's got a little sticker advertising the movie. There's actually 2 movies made on this. The foreign one, and then it was remade in America. And I've had this book for a while now in my collection, and I've always heard good things about it, how it's one of the greatest vampire horror novels ever written, or one of the best modern day ones at least. And yes, I was excited to finally get to reading this. And this is a pretty long novel, not super long. It's 400, almost 500 pages, not quite, 470 pages long, so it's a little bit chunky. And I will say that I don't see what the hype is about with this one, to be honest with you guys. I mean, this book was okay, decent. I liked some parts of it. But man, this book dragged for a lot of it. This one, for those of you who don't know or maybe aren't too familiar with it, I'll get into a little bit of the plot. We basically follow this 12-year-old kid named Oscar who's bullied. He's kind of an outcast at school. He doesn't really have any friends. He doesn't have a father figure in his life, so he's just this very introverted, shy kid who's bullied at school, very socially awkward. And he one day meets this young girl who happens to be a vampire, and they become friends. And I kind of liked this part of the story. I feel like the author does a very good job at characterization. You feel a lot of sympathy for Oscar, him growing up and struggling through life and just trying to make it through day to day, just trying to survive against his just horrible life, basically growing up and being bullied and all this stuff happening. And yeah, you feel a lot of sympathy for him. I feel like the writing in here is pretty strong. And this relationship that forms between him and this vampire is both kind of sweet and charming, but also kind of ominous because of what this little girl actually is. And it, of course, leads to some pretty dark things, and some bad things happen later in the story involving this character. However, what I did not like about this book is that it drags on for a very long time, particularly the middle of this book, and we follow a large cast of characters that has nothing to do with Oscar, nothing to do with Eli, which is the name of the vampire. We're basically following all these different characters in this giant apartment complex in just this suburban type area, I guess. And each of these characters are some way or somehow tied to this vampire. This young vampire girl has an accomplice who basically is this serial killer type of guy. He's this really messed up evil character that sort of collects blood for Eli to drink. He's kind of helping her stay alive while she stays hidden in this apartment building. And all of these characters are somehow have family or friends that are victim to this serial killer or this vampire in one way or another. And this book is basically just about this very slow decay of this apartment building and this community of people, and how some of these people are slowly dying and being picked off one by one. And it's a lot of just slice of life drama with these characters that you don't care anything about, or at least I didn't. pretty much all of the side characters in this book I did not care anything about, and it made the reading experience just such a slog to get through. I really only cared about the main character, Oscar, and then how his relationship with Eli was going to turn out. So yeah, I was interested in like the main plot point of this book, but all the other stuff going on, and we get a lot of that too. It's mostly just following these million different side characters, honestly. So yeah, I can't remember. Let me see. I have my notes on here. What did I give this book? Looks like I gave it a flat 3 out of 5 stars. I can see why some people really like this book and why it got as popular as it did, but I don't think it's quite worth all of the hype that it's gotten, in my opinion. So yeah, that's Let the Right One In by John Lindquist, if that's how you pronounce his name. Flat 3 out of 5 stars. This is the first book I read this month. And again, I need to kind of go through these kind of quickly. Otherwise, this video is going to end up being like an hour long. Okay, the next book that I read this month is book number 7 in the Tarzan series. This is Tarzan the Untamed. And this book takes quite a different turn. This book opens up with just like an explosive axe. This one just, yeah, takes a huge turn from what we've experienced in the Tarzan novels previously. Basically, Tarzan is off on the jungle. I can't remember if he's just like off on like something casual, some hunting expedition or something. And he comes back home to discover all of his friends and servants and his wife dead in this giant house fire. His house is just burned to the ground and falling apart, a pile of rubble. And he discovers all of these dead bodies in this house. And Tarzan basically sets out on this revenge mission. And basically what is happening in this book is I think it takes place during the time of World War I, I believe. Or just after World War I, but the events of the book take place around the time of World War I. So essentially there's this big war going on in the background of this story with like Germany invading Africa and these different countries. And there's basically this big group of German soldiers that raided Tarzan's house and killed all of his friends and family and loved ones. And Tarzan basically just goes into rage mode and hunts down these Nazis and tries to get revenge on them. And it's not quite as action-packed and crazy and violent as it sounds. It kind of is starting out, but during the halfway mark of the story, or actually probably a little bit before the halfway point, the story takes a huge twist. Or not really a big twist, but just like a big direction change kind of, to where he encounters this female German soldier, or what he assumes to be a German soldier. She's kind of like a spy. She's not really a soldier. Yeah, I don't know, something like that. And he basically has the opportunity to kill her, and Tarzan has vowed to himself to like avenge his wife by killing like every German soldier he can find, basically. But he ends up feeling sympathy for this character, and he can't bring himself to harm a woman. So he ends up protecting her in this jungle instead, because she's kind of lost her way and is trying to survive through this jungle against the wildlife and the lions and all of that stuff. So basically he feels sympathy for her and ends up trying to protect her and help her through the jungle instead. And then he also encounters another character who happens to be like a British soldier, and he also is stranded and abandoned in the middle of the African jungle. And so Tarzan ends up like completely giving up his revenge mission and just trying to help these two characters survive as he brings them food, protects them from the various predators of the jungle. And then there's another big twist, like 2/3 of the way through the story, where they discover a lost civilization. If I had $1 for every time characters in an Edgar Rice Burroughs book discovered a lost civilization, I swear there's a new lost civilization discovered in every one of these books. And the lost civilization in this case is, of course, also very sinister, and they have ill intentions for Tarzan and his friends, and are basically trying to capture them and harm them and make them their slaves and that kind of thing. And they have to fight back and manage to escape from this group. And yeah, you get a lot of like the typical stuff you would expect from an Edgar Rice Burroughs book in here. Overall, I was not the biggest fan of this one. It was okay. It wasn't terrible. Definitely not one of my favorite Tarzan books. I gave it a 2.25 out of 5. This is definitely probably one of my least favorite Tarzan books that I've read so far, but it still wasn't too bad. I didn't hate it or anything. So yeah, that's the 7th book in the Tarzan series, Tarzan the Untamed, and the 2nd book I read this month. Okay, I'm going to try to start going a little bit faster because I feel like I've already been filming this video for like 10 minutes. And I've only covered 2 out of 14 books. So the 3rd book that I read this month is House of Fear. This is by James Powell and Jethro Morels. If I'm pronouncing his name right, I don't know. And this is basically a graphic novel. This is called Attack of the Killer Snowman and Other Spooky Stories. And there are, I believe, 5 stories in this. Let me see. Yes, 5 stories in here called Attack of the Killer Snowman, The Curse of Cottonwood Court, Teeth, Dead Lake, and The Leaving. And this is a really cool book that my good friend Goosebumps Completionist actually told me about. I had no idea this even existed or what this even was. But he did a review of this, I believe, on his channel, and he told me about this book. I'm like, this looks pretty cool. I'm going to check this out. And this is basically like Goosebumps type story. This is like kids' horror in graphic novel form. And I enjoyed this for the most part. It wasn't amazing or anything, but I enjoyed most of the stories in here. Like the title suggests, in the cover art for the first story, you basically have a tale about these killer snowmen that come to life and attack these children. And this was just a fun, short and sweet book. All of the stories in here are pretty short, but yeah. My absolute favorite one that I will mention is called Teeth. And this story is basically about a tooth fairy that is a very evil and malevolent tooth fairy. And I don't want to spoil too much, but I will show you guys a quick illustration of what she looks like here. If you can see that well, I don't know. But what the tooth fairy actually looks like in this story is straight nightmare fuel. Like, it is terrifying. And that is by far the best story in this book. That story was awesome. It was creepy. It was messed up. And I loved it. So yeah, this was a pretty fun little graphic novel, like kids horror type of thing. So yeah, that's House of Fear. What did I give this one? I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. This was a pretty decent book. Okay, the next book that I read this month is part of the Ghosts of Fear Street series. This is book number 33, Attack of the Vampire Worms. And this one was written by, let me see, Catherine Hopka. And I actually really enjoyed this one. This was a pretty big surprise. I guess not that big of a surprise. This is another one that came by a recommendation from my friend Goosebumps Completionist. And he absolutely loved this book. I think he gave it like almost a perfect score and said it was one of his favorite, or possibly his favorite Ghost of Fear Street books that he's read. And I went into this expecting it to be kind of just what you would expect from the cover. Just a cheesy creature feature. I mean, it's called Attack of the Vampire Worms. And you have this terrible CGI cover art with just these worms with horrible fake-looking teeth on them. But this is not that at all. This is not the creature feature that you would think it would be based on what you see here on the cover. It turns into more of like, I don't know how to explain it, I guess, without spoiling it. But it's not really a creature feature. But I really did enjoy this book. This was pretty good. It's basically about these 2 kids that discover this cave out in the woods, kind of isolated, and they discover something in this cave that is much different than what you would expect based here on the cover. Yes, there are some creepy creatures in this story that they encounter, and there are technically vampire worms, but they're not exactly what you would think. This book goes in some different directions. It's more of like a haunting type story. There's some evil, like ghost, human type characters in here. And yeah, this was a pretty good book. What did I give it? I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I would say this is definitely one of the better Ghost of Fear Street books I've read as well. I don't think it's quite my top favorite, but one of the better ones I've read. I would recommend giving this one a read. And yeah, that's all I have to say for that one. Okay. The next book that I read this month is another vampire book. I didn't really plan on this, but just somehow I ended up reading like a few different vampire books this month. And this one is also an R.L. Stine book, and that is Goodnight Kiss, part of the Fear Street series. Look at that absolutely gorgeous cover. And this one, I actually loved this book starting out. This one held my attention, and I like flew through this book, at least for the first half of it. I went into this thinking this was just going to be like a cheesy stereotypical like vampire teen romance drama garbage. And the cover, I feel like, kind of makes you expect it to be something along those lines, something stereotypical like that. But this is actually quite a bit different. The story actually opens from the perspective of these two teenaged vampires. I mean, I guess technically they've been, alive for hundreds of years or however long, but they're in the bodies of like teenagers. And these two vampires make a bet with each other. They make a bet to see who can seduce these other teenagers first and turn them into vampires. I believe the lore in this book explains that these vampires have to bite a human 3 times in order to turn them into a vampire, and it has to be just a little bit each time, like just draw like a little bit of blood. Otherwise, if they draw too much, they'll accidentally kill that person. And so yeah, this book really surprised me. It put kind of a unique spin on this vampire story, dealing with like teenagers and romance a little bit. This is not at all what I expected, and I loved the first half of this book. It was very intriguing. Where I did not like this as much, where this book kind of faltered for me, is in the back half, to where you start to get into the more stereotypical formulaic stuff, to where you have the "you gotta believe me" stuff, where one of the characters discovers the existence of these vampires and that they have ill intentions and are trying to turn these humans into vampires. The way that he discovers this is just not convincing at all. It doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, he's trying to convince his friend, hey, these people are vampires. We need to stay away from them. We have to, find some way to kill them. He's trying to convince her, over and over again. And, of course, she doesn't believe him and doesn't want to listen to him. And, yeah, the second half just kind of goes down a lot of, that formulaic stuff. And then the final act was a bit disappointing. I did not enjoy it. It felt kind of anticlimactic. But yeah, the first half of this book was super solid. Overall, this was still a pretty decent Fear Street book. I enjoyed this, and I'm glad that it kind of subverted my expectations when it came to the vampire tropes, especially for being written back in the 90s or whenever this was written. So yeah, I gave this one a 3.25 out of 5. This was a pretty good Fear Street book. Nothing amazing, but pretty good. Okay, the next book that I read this month is a Spine Tingler's book. This one is number 13 in the series, Pet Store. And I was kind of curious about this one. This is another one that came by a recommendation by my good friend Goosebumps Completionist. I shouldn't say recommendation. He actually said that this was one of the worst kids' horror books he's ever read. One of the worst Spine Tingler's books he's ever read. And I 100% agree. This book was horrible. Easily one of the worst kids' horror books I've read. Easily the worst Spine Tingler's book that I've read so far. This book is basically about this family that moves to this new town. Their dad gets this job somewhere off in this new town. And when they get there, they learn that all of the residents of this town are animals that walk around, and they have these signs that hang or are attached to their collars somehow. And the dogs communicate and talk to the people by having words and letters flashing across this sign that's attached to their collar. And these dogs basically run this town and have people as pets. And these dogs basically capture our family, our main characters, and are trying to turn them into their pets. And then the entire story is our main character trying to figure out how to escape. Yes. This book is literally as stupid as it sounds. I'm at a loss for words with this one. This book was god awful. I'm pretty sure. What did I give it? I gave it a flat 1 out of 5 stars. I can't think of anything redeeming about this book whatsoever. This book was horrible. The characters in here are all mind-bogglingly just idiotic. The father figure especially, they get to this town and see these talking dogs and basically are having conversations with these dogs with their words flashing across their signs. And the dad doesn't think this is a big deal. He doesn't see this as a red flag or an issue. The main character is a 12-year-old girl. I forget her name. I don't remember the names of any of the characters in this stupid book. But she sees this and is suspicious of it and is like, this is weird. We need to get out of here and go back to where we used to live. And the dad is like, oh, it's no big deal. We're already here. Let's just make the best of the situation. Like, what? Yeah. This book was horrible. I don't even know what to say about it. This book sucked. Flat 1 out of 5 stars. Don't ever read this book. Okay. The The next book that I read this month is Sour Candy by Kealan Patrick Burke. I read Kin by Kealan Patrick Burke like a couple of months ago, I think, sometime earlier this year, and I absolutely loved it. It was one of my favorite horror novels that I've probably ever read, to be honest, and so I've been wanting to check out more of his work. And this is just a short novella. This was only like, what is it, like 70 pages long. And I heard some good things about this one. This one has a lot of positive reviews on Goodreads, so I thought I would try another one of his books. And this book basically reminds me of like a Twilight Zone or like a Tales from the Dark Side episode crossed with a little bit of like Lovecraftian type horror. You basically have like a middle-aged character in here who has this kid like pop up in his life, suddenly telling him that he's his kid. And this guy is just like, I have no idea who you are. Like, who are you? Like, why are you saying that I'm your dad? And all of the evidence is basically proving that this is his kid. And he has like cops showing up at his house, and all of his family are telling him that he has this son, and this guy has never seen this kid before in his life. And it turns out this kid is possibly some kind of like evil entity tied to some Lovecraftian horror elements. And this story kind of reminds me of a very specific Tales from the Dark Side episode. I believe it was called The New Man, I want to say. I think that's the name of the episode, if I remember correctly. And again, it's got like some Lovecraftian horror elements in there. So this book was all right. I don't really have a lot to say about it, to be honest, and I can't really talk about it much without spoiling it. Again, it's a very short, like 70-page novella. I gave it like a flat 3 out of 5, I think. Let me see. Yeah, flat 3 out of 5 stars for this one. Nowhere near as good as Kin. However, it is very well written. I really do like Kealan Patrick Burke's writing style. I plan to check out more by this author in the future. I already do have a couple of other books by him that I purchased recently that I will be reading sometime in the near future. But yeah, this book was just decent, like mild good. 3 out of 5 stars. Not quite as amazing as all of the Goodreads reviews might lead you to believe, but I think the premise too just didn't really do a lot for me. It just feels too derivative of like certain Twilight Zone and Tales from the Dark Side episodes that we've already seen. And I kind of get that's what he was going for with this. He was kind of like paying homage to that and putting his own spin on that idea that's sort of been done before in like old anthology shows. But yeah, this book was just decent. Okay. It didn't really do a whole lot for me. So yeah, that's Sour Candy by Kealan Patrick Burke. Okay, the next book that I read this month is Full Brutal by Christopher Triana. I talked about this book in a video I made recently where I talk about the top 5 most disturbing books and movies that I've ever seen and read in my life. So I won't really go into a lot of detail with this one here. But I'll just say that this is, well, as you would probably guess, one of the most disturbing books I've ever read, and I did not enjoy it at all. I've read some other disturbing books and seen some other disturbing movies that I've enjoyed quite a bit more than this one. I think the reason I didn't really care for this one as much, it was just too bleak and depressing for my taste and just hopeless. And the main character of this book is the villain, the antagonist of the story. And there's no one you can root for, no characters you can attach yourself to. There's no really mystery with this book or anything. It's literally just the main character, the villain of the story, doing terrible things throughout the entire length of this book, which is like 250 pages of just nonstop evil acts being committed by our main character, this psychopathic teenage girl. And yeah, I did not enjoy it. It was just too dark for my taste. And it's not that I couldn't handle it necessarily. I've read, again, some other pretty disturbing stories that I've quite enjoyed. It's just this one, I didn't get much enjoyment out of. It was well written, I guess. The author, I suppose, managed to shock and make me feel uncomfortable, so I guess he kind of achieved his goal with writing an effed up book. But yeah, this just wasn't for me. I gave it a 2.25 out of 5 because, again, it wasn't terrible, just not for me. So yeah. Okay, the next book I read this month is a children's classic. This is a book that I absolutely loved as a kid and I read this book a lot when I was a kid, and I wanted to reread it, and I kind of decided to do a casual like read through of all of this author's work once again, and that is Beverly Cleary's books, and this is her very first book she ever wrote, Henry Huggins. This is the exact copy that I've had ever since I was a kid, and I wanted to reread it, and I would say that this book is still pretty good. I gave this a 3.25 out of 5. If you've read Beverly Cleary, you know what she's about. They're basically just a children's series of books with various characters that take place in this world. You have Ramona, Beezus, and then, of course, the main star of the show, Henry Huggins, which this book is about. And each chapter is kind of like a short story where he embarks on some kind of shenanigan or gets into some sort of mischief. And then he also finds his dog Ribsy, who is another famous character of this series, who is a stray dog that he adopts. And it turns out this dog is not just a stray, but once belonged to another kid. And then he sort of has to kind of fight over ownership of this dog with this other kid. And a lot of other shenanigans ensue. And yeah, this is just a fun, cute, charming kids book. And I've always loved reading these as a kid. This is like an entire series of books. I have the complete collection back here on my bookshelf. And I plan through reading through all of Beverly Cleary's books at some point. I believe I read most of them when I was a kid. I don't think I read all of them. But yeah, I'm excited to kind of go through and revisit this series again. And yeah, this was a fun book. 3.25 out of 5. I think Beverly Cleary is one of the best children's authors of all time, in my opinion. And these books are pretty old, too. This says the 50th anniversary on it. When was this written? This book was originally written in 1950. So yeah, these books are pretty old. Yeah, that's Henry Huggins. This is a pretty good book. Okay, the next book that I read this month is Twilight Eyes by Dean Koontz. I did an individual review for this, so I won't be going into a lot of detail about this one here. But again, this is a reread. I read this book like 7 or 8 years ago or so, or maybe more. Maybe it's been like 9 years now. I don't know. And this is a pretty good book. Not quite as good as I remembered it being. I remember loving this book. This was the very first Dean Koontz book that I ever read. I gave it like a perfect 5 out of 5 stars. To be fair, when I first read this all those years ago, I didn't have a ton of experience with adult horror. At that time in my life, I wasn't reading nearly as much as I am now. And so when I read this all those years ago, this really just kind of changed my perspective and kind of opened my eyes. And I hadn't really read anything like this. So it really just kind of blew me away, I guess, and made me fall in love with the writing and the story. And it made me want to check out the rest of this author's work. I became an instant fan of this author. And of course, I would go on to read like 20 of his other books. And upon reread, again, this didn't really hold up as well as I was hoping. I didn't love it quite as much. I saw some more of the flaws with it this time around. But this is still a very good book. I gave it a solid 4 out of 5 stars. I still think that this is one of his better novels, or one of his best, possibly. I love the carnival setting. The first part of the story is better. The first half of the story takes place in a carnival, and then the second part of the story takes place outside of the carnival, where our two main characters go on this mission to hunt down these evil, goblin, demonic-like creatures that are basically trying to destroy the world. And it's basically about this battle between good versus evil. And yeah, that's Twilight Eyes by Dean Koontz. If you want to hear my thoughts more on this one, I have that video up where I talk about this more. But yeah, solid 4 out of 5 stars for this one. This is a pretty darn good book. Okay, the next book that I read this month is part of the Goosebumps Horrorland series, and that is When the Ghost Dog Howls. This is book number 13, and I decided to start reading through this again. This is the last Goosebumps book series, besides the newest one, House of Shivers, of course, that I need to finish my read-through of so I can do a ranking of the series. I have read every single other Goosebumps book there is that's been published up to this point, and then even after this with Slappy World and Most Wanted. And yeah, I'm hoping to sometime soon here finish this series up and then do a ranking of the series. So yeah, this was When the Ghost Dog Howls. This one was just okay. I actually liked the opening sequence, I think, of this book the best, even though it doesn't really have anything to do with like the main plot of this book. So these Arc 2, this is part of Arc 2 of the Horrorland series. And these Arc 2 books are structured a little bit differently than Arc 1. The first arc of Horrorland books basically had like an 80 to 90 page like main story. And then the last like 30 pages of the book had our main characters go into the Horrorland theme park and then be stuck there and trying to figure out how to escape and sort of meeting up with the characters from other books. So it has like this kind of overarching story to it. Arc 2 is a little bit different. Arc 2 starts with our main characters in the Horrorland theme park, and then they encounter just some wild and crazy situations while they're in this theme park, and then they go into like this gift shop where they obtain some kind of item, and then as they leave this Horrorland theme park, this item somehow ties into the main plot of the story, which carries on for the last like 100 or so pages of the book. And I loved the opening sequence of this book. Their main characters are part of like this circus act that involves like these zombies, and there's these clowns juggling like shrunken heads, and it's just absolutely bonkers. I loved it. I thought it was great. I was just like, what the heck am I reading right now? Unfortunately, the main story for this one, it had kind of a good idea to it. There's like this old Scottish folklore that has like the legend of this ghost dog on here, and how he's basically haunting these kids because of this dog's tooth that they obtained at this gift shop in Horrorland. And I kind of like the idea here, but the execution was just horrible. Basically, this dog tooth grants them these wishes. It's sort of like this genie in a bottle, be careful what you wish for type plot. And the whole middle of this book just feels directionless and aimless and like a waste of time. These kids are basically just fighting over this dog's tooth. There's these random wishes being made using the power and magic of this dog tooth. And yeah, I did not care for the majority of this book, to be honest. Again, it has a cool idea, and I like the opening act, but the execution of like the main story of this just did not feel very good. So yeah, When the Ghost Dog Howls, what did I give this one? A 2.25 out of 5. Not terrible, but not that great either. Just kind of middle of the road. Okay, the next book that I read this month is the next book in the Henry Huggins series. This is Henry and Beezus, and I also quite enjoyed this one. I also gave this one a 3.25 out of 5. This is the second book in the Henry Huggins series. I forget how many books there are in total in this series. Trying to glance up at my shelf here. I think there's like 6 or 7 Henry Huggins books, and then we start to follow the other characters that are in this world of books. We follow like Ramona and Beezus and some of the other characters. In this one, yeah, I don't really have a lot to say about these. These are just fun, charming children's books. I have a lot of nostalgia for these because I grew up reading them. If you guys have read Beverly Cleary or these books, you already know what these are like, what these are about. Each chapter is kind of like a short story where Henry Huggins and his friends just get into different mischief. And yeah, these are just fun, charming books from a different time. Again, these are older books, so these are from like a more innocent like time era. And yeah, I don't know what to say about these. This was just a good book. Nothing amazing, but I've been enjoying reading through these. Okay, the next book I read this month is another Goosebumps Horrorland book. This one is book number 14, A Little Shop of Hamsters. And I actually read this one a long time ago, I think back when it came out. I didn't remember anything about it. And upon reread, I can see why I didn't remember anything about it, because I did not really care for this book. I gave it a 1.75 out of 5. I don't have a lot to say about this one. I just didn't care for it. Basically, the entire plot of this story is our main character wants pets, and his parents don't think he's responsible enough to have pets, so he gets a job working at this pet store that has a lot of hamsters, and if he proves that he's responsible and can take care of them, then his parents will possibly finally let him get one of these hamsters as a pet. And there's really not a lot that happens throughout this book. It's just pretty boring and slowly paced. And then at the very end, we get some action to where these giant hamsters appear. Basically, these hamsters turn giant. It's basically a ripoff of Monster Blood 2 with Cuddles, where there's this giant hamster and our main character is battling him. That's literally the climax of this book. It's a Monster Blood 2 ripoff. And yeah, I did not really care for this one. 1.75 out of 5. Not the worst thing I've ever read, but it wasn't very good. I can't really recommend this one. So yeah, that's Little Shop of Hamsters. It was just kind of whatever to me. Okay, and then the very last book that I read this month. This is also another book that was recommended to me by my good friend Goosebumps Completionist, and that is It Watches in the Dark by Jeff Strand. And this is apparently part of a new kids horror series called Eek. There's a little like thing down here that says Eek on it, and then on the back, they're not numbered. No, I guess it's here on the spine too. It just says Eek is the name of the series. The second book is already announced. This is the first one called It Watches in the Dark. And what's interesting to me is Jeff Strand is a pretty well-known author of like adult horror. I have not yet read any of his books, but I've kind of had my eyes on some of them for a while. I've seen some reviews of some of his books, and I've been wanting to check some of them out. Eventually, I still will probably read some of his adult horror novels in the future. But from what I've heard and seen, he tends to write more of like the extreme, like splatterpunk type horror books. I was surprised to see that he came out with a children's horror novel. And this is pretty long, a little bit longer than your typical kids horror book. It's like 220 pages long. And this was decent. This was like mildly good to me. I gave it a flat 3 out of 5 stars. I didn't quite love it. It's kind of a cool premise, I guess. It's basically about our two main characters, these like 12-year-old kids, I think they are, go on like this canoeing or kayaking trip with their dad, and their dad gets injured. I think he like hits his head on something and gets knocked unconscious, and the kids basically kayak or paddle downstream, and they find this dock where they're able to get him out of the water onto land, and they discover this town, this small town in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of like this giant woods. And this town is very creepy. These people that live in this town are very strange and kind of cult-like, and they have this scarecrow in like the middle of this town as like this shrine basically, and they tell these kids that this scarecrow protects them, and that the scarecrow is watching over them, and all these creepy things. This book kind of reminds me of a kid's version of like the Children of the Corn mixed with like a little bit of Shirley Jackson's like The Lottery or something, with this very like cult-like community. These people are trying to keep them in this town, and the scarecrow is alive, and he is kind of like the main villain of the story. And yeah, it has kind of a cool idea. I don't know what it was about this. I just didn't love this book or think it was anything amazing. Again, I gave it a flat 3 out of 5 stars. The writing, this is my first experience with Jeff Strand. I wasn't really all that taken with the writing style. And it is possible that maybe it's just with this kids' horror book, with Jeff Strand not having a lot of experience writing for kids' horror, or maybe it's just wasn't my cup of tea. I don't know. There was just something about the writing style I wasn't a big fan of. We don't get much description in this book of anything. It's mostly just all action and dialogue. I don't even know what like... Okay, so apparently my phone ran out of storage space as I was in the middle of recording that video. Thankfully, I was almost done anyway. I was talking about the last book that I read, It Watches in the Dark. I don't remember what else I said about it, but I was just about done anyway. I don't think I went on for too much longer when my phone stopped recording, fortunately. So I guess I'll just end the video here. That is all 14 books that I read this month. As usual, feel free to comment down below with your thoughts and opinions of any of these books if you've read them, or just anything else you want to share in general. Like and subscribe if you guys want to, if you enjoy my content. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.